Hello everybody and welcome to the Filipino Freethinkers podcast that's also a video. I am Red and today I am very honored to be with Carlos Conde. He will tell us a little bit about his work, but I've been following what he's been writing about the human rights situations in our country. So Carlos, tell us a bit about what you do.
Well, yeah, thanks, Red, for having me here on your program, podcast, or however you call this. But
it's a show.
It's a show, and we're very excited that this is happening. So I'm the Philippine researcher for Human Rights Watch. I've been a researcher for Human Rights Watch for the past 5 years. I'm covering mainly the Philippines and all sorts of human rights issues in the Philippines, and involves extrajudicial killings, child labor, LGBT rights, women's rights, the whole gamut of human rights issues in the Philippines. Before this, I was a journalist. I used to write for the New York Times for 10 years and other publications before that.
And how are you still alive as a human?
Well, yeah, it's a tricky thing to do. But look, the Philippines has always had these problems with human rights abuses, even before Duterte, and it has always made human rights defenders and human rights activists like myself anxious about security. We do take care of ourselves. We do take precautions. So, and we're not. There are, just as journalists would say, there are no stories that worth your life. Among human rights defenders, that's probably true as well. So we tend to calibrate our responses very, very, accordingly.
And I'm sure some of your friends or colleagues haven't been as lucky as you.
Well, yeah, and that's the hard part here. I mean, as I said about the human rights situation in the Philippines, a lot of my former colleagues, for instance, when I was a journalist, a lot of them were murdered. I used to be the Secretary General of the National Union of Journalists of the Philippines, and I saw firsthand the problem with media killings in the Philippines. And now, as an advocate myself, as a human rights researcher and advocate, we've documented cases of human rights defenders and activists being harassed and killed, let alone activists or environmentalists that are targeted by state security forces now and in the past.
So we've mentioned human rights so many times, but it's kind of turning into a bad word in the country, human rights. Even around the world, human rights is seen as this thing that's only for the rich. It's an ivory tower idea that's not very practical. Why do you think we ended up this way?
Well, look, that is quite disheartening given the history, the experience of the Philippines, for instance, with human rights. Going way back to the Marcos dictatorship, where human rights violations were quite pervasive, and that there was, a response by human rights activists and even journalists as well to try to end all of that. And so, what I'm saying is the experience of the Philippines with human rights has always been good. Now, what happened is that, President Duterte happened. And it's like the first thing he did when he came to power was pretty much, demonize not only drug users, but also human rights activists as well, and also, and to some extent, journalists. So it's, human rights has become sort of like the enemy, but that's only because the true enemies of human rights are misusing it and are turning it around, and like many other regimes in other parts of the world, and it's a very convenient way to gain popularity, because the argument that, look, why are you just concerned about the human rights of drug users or activists, and why are you not concerned about the human rights of victims of crime? It's not even an argument, because it's not, human rights activists, human rights defenders, we defend the human rights of people who are victimized mainly by the state. The crimes, normal crimes, regular crimes that are being committed against ordinary citizens, that's the job of the police and the law enforcers to look after those cases.
Yeah, exactly.
Our job, in fact, is to make sure. I mean, speaking of crime, our job is to make sure that when crime is rampant, our job as human rights activists is to check, to criticize the police for not dealing with that crime, with that problem.
Yeah. So, as a journalist, like an extra source of stress, I suppose, for you is how fake news is kind of proliferating around the world, in the US and especially in the Philippines, and that fake news is often used to bolster arguments about against human rights.
Yeah.
You know, to trump up, let's say, the figures and facts about the prevalence of drugs and drug use in the country. So how do you feel about like people calling, or some people calling media, you know, biased, and let's not trust these traditional media sources and just sort of make our own, listen to the people that we trust and are on our side? How do you feel about that?
I feel very, very sad about that, actually. I mean, it's, but look, demagogues, populists, tyrants, they all try to discredit institutions that can check their abuse of power. And often it's the media. And I'm not surprised that this is happening, and because in fact this is not the first time that fake news is coming out. This is not the first time that so much propaganda against human rights activists, I mean human rights victims, and even journalists are coming out. I mean, and the only way to deal with that really is to just read up. It's not, you cannot just rely on the internet, on social media to educate yourself. So, I mean, you have to take that extra step of trying to, if you're really concerned about politics, about what's going on, and not just swallowing everything that's being fed to you by the likes of Duterte. If you're really concerned about that, you have to read up. You have to educate yourself. And there are a lot of stuff on the online that you can actually read in order to educate yourself. Right now, I'm reading, for instance, because of what's happening in the Philippines, I'm now trying to go back on the history of the world in terms of tyrants and despots and demagogues like Hitler. And in fact, there's this one little book. I don't know if I can promote it here, but I've just finished reading a book called On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder.
Okay.
And it's a small book, but it lists there 20 lessons that we can learn in the 20th century about tyrants and demagogues.
What's the one that sticks out the most to you?
You know, it's that you have to go out, get out of the screen, get offline and read books. Read all this literature that's out there to try to nourish your mind about the issues. Because if you just rely on Facebook, your intellect, your brain is going to be debased, massively.
Yeah.
And I know that's better said than done, and not a lot of people have the luxury of time or probably even buying books.
Yeah.
But it has to be done, and I think you just have to resist. The other thing that sticks to me about that book is that once a tyrant says all these familiar things about populism, you just have to resist the impulse to swallow everything. And I think that's how you tackle fake news. Like in my personal experience, my Twitter feed, I've converted that basically as a feed of news organizations that I trust. I follow, people, but now I basically just, my timeline is about, trustworthy news sources. You can do that as well.
Yeah.
I probably follow you, but I must have muted you already because I don't.
I'm hurt.
Because I don't. I no longer follow just individuals.
Yeah.
Even those I agree with.
Yeah.
I just follow on Twitter at least,
News.
Yeah. New York Times, Washington Post, Philippine Daily Inquirer, a Rappler, of PCIJ, even those who you don't completely agree with, but are, they do have some semblance of professionalism in what they do. Manila Times, Manila Standard, the Philippine Star, at least these people are accountable.
Yeah, they're trying.
They're trying to be accountable.
Yeah.
So, you can actually take them to account for what they publish, unlike, trolls or these anonymous sites for fake news.
I see. So you mentioned Twitter timelines, and I imagine that a lot of this, like seeing all of the human rights abuses happen, not only in the Philippines, because you're also familiar, of course, with what's happening around the world.
Yeah.
So isn't it too stressful? Like doesn't it overwhelm you? Like, don't you sometimes wake up and think, where do I even start? Like, like some people, they just give up. They just do something else. They don't inform themselves, not because they don't want to know, but because they know too much already.
Yeah.
And it's stressful. It's hard enough to live and face your own problems, but to know about the problems going on around you.
That's true.
Like, how do you cope?
Yeah, well, that's really difficult because given how we consume media right now, and mostly on Facebook, for instance, the tendency would be just to tune out and not, in my case, there have been times that I deactivated my Facebook account because I just couldn't take the for lack of a better word, stupidity that's out there, and I deactivated my account, and also because if you get sucked into this, to it, you just can't work properly. You just can't function properly. So if you want to do any meaningful work, sometimes you just have to tune out.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with that is, if you don't have, I'm comfortable doing that because I'm consciously, seeking out, news from trustworthy sources.
Yeah.
But those who don't are losing out on the discussion on Facebook, for instance. Like, even though there's a tendency now to also unfriend or unfollow those who you don't agree with. So you create your own echo chamber and your own bubble, and that's equally, I think, damaging as deactivating your Facebook. Yeah. So it's a challenge. It's very stressful, but I think, and I can't actually suggest any effective way to deal with it. So far, it has been in trying to sometimes you need to decompress. Yeah. Sometimes you need to get out and just empty your mind. So that's what deactivating my Facebook account does. Yeah. But sooner or later I have to go back.
Yeah.
And re-engage. But I think the most effective way you can handle that is just to be conscious about the need for you to seek other opinion, other perspective, without hurting your without this offending your sensibilities or your intellect, and also to be conscious about really just at times you need to step back and let it just go, and then take a deep breath and re-engage, because you can't do this in any sustainable way endlessly. You have to decompress. You have to step back.
Yeah. And finally, thank you for those tips, by the way, on how to cope. But are there any other messages you want to send to all your fellow human rights defenders and activists and journalists, and just people who are still engaging but could use some boost?
Yeah, sure. Look, there has been a very significant interplay of journalism and human rights activism in the Philippines in the age of Duterte, and that is always good. Right now, we're seeing quite a lot of good work being done by journalists reporting about not just the killings, but on many other human rights violations in the Philippines, and that is good. We at Human Rights Watch, we value the work of journalists because we look at the media as our, collaborator or even our platform for the job for the things that we do, and it's just. We continue to support journalists in terms of, making sure that their voices are heard and making sure to be in solidarity with them when they are being attacked or when they are being under pressure by governments. And to my fellow human rights advocates, it's sometimes we go back to the basics. Sometimes we need to go back to the basics and just, reevaluate how we do things. Yeah. And one of my main takeaways from this regime and what's it's done to the human rights community is that the age of human rights work that is partisan, that is not universal, I think that's over. We have to re-embrace human rights as a universal principle. The human rights of an ordinary drug user is equally important than the human rights of an activist. Yeah. You cannot ignore the ordinary people. Yeah. You cannot just focus on who your friends are in the human rights community. You cannot just focus on activists. I mean, I've been saying this when I was a journalist all this time. As a journalist, we are being under attack, but really we cannot just focus on our ranks. We should report on the attacks being done on other people. Yeah. That's the only way we can have a certain amount of solidarity with the public. The same way with human rights advocates now. You cannot just focus on the human rights of certain sectors of the population that you think you are ideologically aligned with. You have to be respectful and of the rights of many others, especially the really poor ones, because they're the ones that need it the most, as we are seeing now in this war on drugs.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for talking to us.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and enjoy New York.
Thank you.